Hello, good evening, everyone. Just want to make sure you can hear me. Okay, good. It's weird that I cannot hear anything from your side, but you can hear me, but we'll go with the flow. True growth mindset here. So just wanted to go over some of the key results of the engagement survey we conducted May through June earlier this year. Thank you everyone for those who participated. Your inputs are greatly valuable. We had 30% of our membership who responded, just down from 40% that we had last year. But overall, the results were very positive and comparable to what we saw last year. Just a couple of points that we wanted to highlight here that we are trying to dwell more on. The first one being, the question we had asked you is that what would help you to be more engaged and realize more value from your membership? And 85% of you said that networking opportunities with the attendees would be the most important thing and valuable to you as part of your SIM membership. And then the next question was about how would you like to attend events starting fall? So today is the prime example, and we received equal responses for in-person and hybrid options. So if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about what we are planning to do as next steps based on some of these things that we heard. So TJ, if you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the actions taken so far, we conducted a brainstorming sessions with the chapter members as part of the engagement networking event, and we tried to receive clarifications and suggestions on the two questions specifically on the previous slide in terms of what it means for increased networking opportunities with the membership, as well as what does hybrid mean for you. So we are taking notes based on the input we received and feedback we received, and we continue to fine tune what the engagement and networking events look like based on those inputs. So we had a workplace integration related discussion at the last engagement networking event, and for this month, or the next month rather, in October, on October 11th, we have a discussion planned around cybersecurity that Troy is planning to lead. So the idea is to get inputs from the membership and from the chapter leaders talking about the challenges and successes they are facing for some of the topics that we have identified as a team that are important for us. We are also collaborating with the programs team for the topics of interest that you've indicated for planning the 2022 chapter meetings as well. So that's pretty much the inputs that I wanted to share with you, but please feel free to reach out if you would like to facilitate one of the engagement networking events that I just spoke about. Back to you, Bipin.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Amelia. Just moving on, the next page is tell us about you, tonight's guest and a few members. I'm looking at the crowd here. You know, one person was the guest, and I'll leave it to you, Brian, just to give a quick introduction about yourself.
I'm Brian McKay, and I worked with Bipin for many years. I think what, 15, maybe.
So it is.
Yeah, I lived here in the Valley for 28 years and kind of been to the consulting data strategy.
So, anybody else? Anybody online? Just, any guests of yours from any board members or chapter members, feel free to highlight that. Right. Just a quick slide on upcoming events. As you can see, we have moderated this meeting to have the hybrid nature, Zoom and in person. And as I said, as we work through the case, make sure that there's a much more better experience in trying to go through the experiences and person perspective. So, as you can see, I'll talk a little bit about this week, today's even in a bit, but the next couple of next sessions coming up in October and November, we have the cyber talent. What we are finding from what are the skill sets, critical skill sets, and none of them than the person who will be specifically taking that who's over, who is the SIM Director of Education and is also a faculty director at ASU. And then in November, we're going to have the topic about cloud readiness and cloud strategy, and something that Simon Taylor, the previous president, and I will be moderating, sharing insights into security and all the things that come along with moving from a cloud data center on physical data center into migration to the cloud. All right, with that, I'm just going to go into tonight's program. I'll invite our guest, Maureen Musselman, who is the EVP Chief Financial Officer at Vitalant.org, and also Steve Reger. The conversation is going to be interesting. I'm going to be moderating that. I'll invite the panel up to the stage. Now, the conversation, the topic is custom payment. Before I answer the stage, I just want to give you an overlay of what we talked about. This was the topic that came up as a priority item or a big item that SIM chapter members wanted to talk about. Even the time was taken. And in preparing for this, it was interesting, when we had conversations with Steve, the lens that IT looks at cost containment probably is a little different from what Maureen as a CFO looks at, and from a sales or product or a SaaS person looks at. So we have a couple of initial thought processes to just get the topic going, and I'll start with an introduction. I'll let the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll go into some of the questions that we have in front of them. Feel free to jump in and ask any questions, and PJ will be looking at the Zoom questions as they come in, and we will go off based on how the questions are rolling in. We do have a couple of questions that we want to put in front of the panel to get their point of view from a CIO perspective, which would be me, from a CFO perspective, and of course a product vendor perspective, which I thought was interesting because IT has, as we had some conversations, different feeling of product vendors selling directly to business, and how does IT play into that, and some great conversations there. So feel free to participate and ask questions along the way. All right, I'm going to start with Maureen.
Thank you. You guys hear me okay? So I will. As Bipin mentioned, I'm the CFO for Vitalant, which is the second largest blood banking organization in the U.S. Prior to that, Bipin and I actually worked together at Make-a-Wish for a couple of years there. But before going into nonprofit, the majority of my career was spent at American Express, and I'd actually spent 28 years there over a number of different, I held a number of different roles there. But as I started thinking about our conversation tonight, probably the roles that I had that were the most impactful or have the most significance to our discussion this evening were really around, I was an LFO for our consumer customer service, global customer service organization. And during that time, I had responsibility for managing a $200 million investment portfolio that also had savings targets associated with it. I was also the CFO for our global business services at American Express, which was our shared servicing, and I supported both our global real estate portfolio as well as our shared servicing organization, in which we always had cost targets that we had to meet and initiatives on finding efficiencies. And then I was also responsible for a global transformation project within our finance, setting up shared servicing, having to decide whether we onshore or offshore, and throughout all of these roles, as well as with my two current CFO roles that I've held outside of corporate America, I've really had to focus on, as I said, do we, onshore, do we offshore? Do we buy or do we lease? Do we use CapEx or do we use OpEx? As well as what are really the targets from a technology investment return do we need to hit? And how do we think about that? And so I really am looking forward to digging down a little deeper into those subjects this evening.
Hi everyone, my name is Steve Reger. I'm the Regional VP of Sales for SyncHR. We are a HR payroll benefit and provider, providing a SaaS-based solution, selling mostly to technology to mid to enterprise companies. I appreciate the opportunity to come sit here and talk with all of you today. Really, part of this conversation is talking about really the benefits of utilizing a SaaS solution, understanding really what companies oftentimes are looking at and trying to evaluate and different providers and systems to be able to figure out what's the best solution. My personal experience as I've been in this industry for about 30 years. I've worked for the ADPs, the Paychecks, and Ceridians, and a lot of other HCM providers over the years. So I have a little bit of unique perspective on implementing different solutions and really working with different and organizations of different sizes and understanding what has made a successful implementation versus some that have been less than successful. And hopefully we'll be able to kind of uncover some of those different things today and share all that with all of you.
Thank you, Maureen and Stephen. Just a quick introduction about myself. So, I'm currently the CIO of Make-a-Wish, and prior to that, I was in consulting, as Brian mentioned, 15 plus years at a Fortune 100 company like Honeywell. And the conversation was interesting for me personally because every year there was this big pressure to the consultants to take cost out, and IT was always seen as a cost center. So we'll get into that a bit about, there were big conversations or good questions that we had for, when Steve and Maureen, we met earlier this week about how does business see IT? What's the importance? It also comes into the picture as to what stage of an organization you're in. You're a growing organization, are you mature? What type of it is? And there comes a conversation about cost containment. On a side note, unrecorded conversation, I was asking Maureen too as to why do CFOs always come to CIOs at the end to take out costs? When we have 2 months left in the budget year and all the projects have to continue and things like that. So the conversation again, I think from a chapter member's perspective, if I were to tie it out, was the notion, why is it only IT that gets asked? How does cost containment look like from an IT perspective? And where we went with that a bit from a business perspective, we talk about the conundrum between the business and IT and how IT is looked at. Is IT looked at as a cost center and taking out the cost? So, a couple of questions I have. I'll start with Steve first. Because we had the conversations about who do you sell to, and I got some interesting perspectives from Steve as to what would we like to sell to. And I'll let him talk a bit because after that, once you understand the customer, once you understand the sell model, we from IT, it opened up a lot of eyes for me as to recognizing how would the product vendors want to look at it from that perspective. As much as IT plays a sweep, are we at the decision table? There were questions, and we'll come back to it in probably a poll question or something, but I want to start with Steve asking his sell cycle, if you will, of a product which affects IT at some point of time, but when does it happen?
So, as we kind of talked a little bit about the other day, most of my sales reps, myself, and when we're out and talking with different companies, we're often trying to talk to CFOs. We want to talk to CEOs of organizations. But the reality is that oftentimes we're usually talking with a CHRO, a VP of HR, HR manager, maybe a payroll person, because that's usually where projects get started, because there's some problem. And that problem is kind of bubbled up throughout the organization. From a IT perspective, it's normally falls on IT to help make sure that it gets implemented, that all security protocols are met. But as we kind of talked about, we look at it as we want to have everyone from an organization that is going to touch the system be part of that conversation. Because I could tell you from doing this for so many years that implementations that are successful are ones that involve in all different kind of viewpoints of an organization. You want to have finance involved because they're going to bring a different perspective of how things hit the GL, ultimately what kind of reporting that needs to roll up to them. But you also need to have IT involved because there may be other solutions that you want to integrate to. And those solutions are key to automating kind of manual processes. So oftentimes when companies are evaluating different systems, it's not about just taking the data from an old system and putting it into a new one. It's where do you build efficiencies? How do you make this process more efficient so that way you could do more with maybe fewer resources, or you're able to just do more with the same resources. But again, it's a matter of collaborating with a group of individuals that all have some input into the value of that system, and really understanding what your own needs are as an organization, so that way you can really choose the best system for your company.
So one of the things I wanted to hone in is the notion that products, and I've heard this with even bigger organizations or bigger product companies like SAP or Salesforce, and their conversations often start not in IT. But they would want to talk to a business leader who actually has a problem area, and that's how the conversation starts typically. One other extreme example I can give you is, when I wanted to, when back at Make-a-Wish, when we were doing the digital transformation, for me to get businesses engaged and feel good about it, I had taken them on a tour of Dreamforce, for example, Salesforce's thing. Kind of a joke that I want them to drink the Kool-Aid of Salesforce to get them excited. So the notion that the products actually starts with business is the way it happens. I know most of in IT don't like it that way because we want to have a seat at the table to prescribe the notion to business about how can we help support that. So one of the conversations or one of the partnerships we had between me and Maureen was when we implemented NetSuite program last year at Make-a-Wish, and it was a big undertaking because Make-a-Wish is a federated model, and we're bringing together GLs and accounting systems of 60 different chapters into a single instance multi-cloud initiative. Question I have for Maureen is, from a business perspective, when is there a right time to involve IT? What is the right time? How do you look at it from a business perspective to engage IT?
I can kind of answer this two ways, because one is going to be from a consumer, a business owner going into an ERP system, and the other is as finance support for business who wants to implement a new system. And what I would tell you, when I'm supporting a business owner who sees something shiny and wants to go about implementing it, I don't want them to make a decision without finance and IT at the table, because I think both have to be there. If they're not, that's when issues happen, and I have seen this happen, because the business will go out and they'll listen to a sales pitch and they will decide that this is what they need or this is what they want, and it doesn't always fit into the architecture of what IT has built. And IT sometimes is scrambling at the last minute to try and deliver or implement or set up what the business has gone out and done. I was fortunate enough that American Express, we had a little bit more control on that, and so it generally was the three sitting at the table before any decision was made. I will tell you that as a business owner of a system that I'm going to implement, I couldn't imagine making the decision without my IT person right there, because first of all, I am not an expert, and I generally don't believe salesmen. So I am always very skeptical, and I do want, a subject matter expert with me as I'm making those decisions. So it's very important to me that I have that expertise, and I would not make a technology system decision without somebody from tech there.
Thank you for that, Maureen. Tying it back to the cost containment conversation or a cost optimization, one of the conversations, Dan Mazzola was on the call the other day too, when he talked about what's CFO looking for when you talk about a cost optimization from an IT perspective. And I'll just give you a overview and let you add some more color to it. We start with the notion, what's an IT spend at an organization? And there are benchmarks for that. If you look at manufacturing, they say 2% of revenue to 4%. And if it's in a digital transformation year, it's always almost up to 5 to 10% of your annual revenues. So there isn't, there's some benchmarks, but I'd be very curious to know how CFOs look at it when CIOs come to CFOs and ask for the whole big money for ERP and multi-million-dollar budgets. That's one. The second thing Dan wanted to probe in also was the notion about how do CIOs or IT feel, what should we do to feel comfortable at the table to make those decisions? Is it maturity? Is it trust? Is it, because keep in mind, as you all know, IT was always seen as a cost center, but now IT is being moved to a position where they are looking at IT to make changes into not only the bottom line, but also the top line, be it providing services, additional services, data, we talk about data monetization and so on and so forth. So very curious to know from a CFO perspective, what are the avenues that IT, or what should we be doing better? Let me start with the cost containment conversation as to what does cost containment or cost optimization mean from a CFO perspective? And the second question being, what else should we be doing?
So I think from a cost containment or cost optimization, there's a couple of ways to look at it, because sometimes IT gets a black eye because there's a lot of technology investment depending upon what cycle your business is, right? Whether you're growing, whether you're mature, whether you are a digital business. And so the way that I look at it is what I can share with you is there's kind of the minimum level to run the business. And that's really where IT is responsible for. But the majority of time, IT also has in their budget all of the investments that are happening across the business. And so you really have to separate those two, I think, first of all, so that you can understand what the CIO can control directly and what the CIO can control influentially, because they really do have the relationship with the vendor as things are coming on. It's their team that could be doing the work. And so there are ways to look at that. But I don't also look at IT, it is a cost center. But when you look at cost reduction, cost containment, you also have to look at your value for your money. So there are ways in which you can improve efficiencies, right? And you can redeploy staff or resources into other areas that are more impactful. So you're not going to have a true cost reduction, but you're going to have efficiency gains, and you're going to add value that way. The other is there are things that IT can do through automation, through new system recommendations that actually make the employees more efficient or reach the customer in a different way that actually help the organization drive revenue. So I think it does depend on where the business is at and what your business cycle is. And I think it's helping IT be able to tell the story of efficiency gains as well as just cost reductions. Because when you think about cost reductions, you really have to look at the unintended consequences, downstream, what's this going to do, and really overall, what are we trying to do? What is the end goal? And then based on that, it's, are there unintended consequences? What do we need to deliver? And then the other lens I kind of look through is what are the investment requirements? Because every re-engineering or every cost containment or investment has some cost associated with it, right? And any change you want to make to try and drive efficiencies has a cost associated with it. And so it's really understanding and digging into all of those specific costs, whether it's getting a new vendor to put paper towels in your restrooms or whether it's getting a new data center. Believe it or not, it's either time or money resources. And so you really have to understand and dig into that. And that's another area where I make sure that it's really important that you uncover all of those costs when you're making that decision. Next question.
What do we do to get a seat at the table?
A seat at the table. From my perspective, it's to be a trusted partner, to be transparent, upfront with what can and can't be done, because that's what's going to build the trust as well. To be forthcoming with information, to provide guidance, whether sometimes we want to hear it or not, quite honestly. But I think it is about trust and kind of the transparency, which I think is the most important.
Maureen, for you, why don't, when their CFOs or CPOs are approached by salespeople, why don't they automatically just redirect those folks over to the CIO or someone else in the IT department?
I do. Honestly, I'm like, the last thing I want to do is talk to a salesperson. Sorry. And I may very well be unique, but you do have to have the business. Yes. You do have to have the business be involved, but yes, I generally do. They should. Sorry.
I have a question for Steve in that. So one of the conversations that have come up, or as you all know, as IT leaders in the last 5 to 6 years, and it's touched everybody, is the notion of moving away from CapEx to OpEx. And I joked to Steve the other day, you're riding that wave of selling the notion of OpEx, but one of the things that, and I think Maureen can talk a little more intrinsically about it, was CapEx need not be always good, or OpEx need not be always good. It depends on the cash flow, which as a CIO, I had no clue when selling a CapEx model or an OpEx model, and some of the things that Maureen as a CFO looked at and found. But I'll pass it on to Maureen in a minute, but before, let me ask Steve, how has that changed the selling landscape, the whole CapEx to OpEx models?
Well, again, the way I look at it is when we're engaging, and certainly IT, when we're engaging really anyone within the organization, we're always talking about all of the systems that come into play. So when you're looking at different solutions out there, it's trying to find, again, a system that is going to play nice with others. You want to be able to build those efficiencies so that way you could automate some processes where you're taking out some of the unknown and manual effort that is involved. So an example of that might be, oftentimes companies have obviously the process of hiring new employees, and if someone gets hired, there's emails that get sent off to IT. Hey, you need to set this person up in the system. You need to be able to get their email situated. You give them a laptop. You give them access for security clearance and so on. And then when offboarding employees, you have to then take back all that intellectual capital that you've given them and remove their access. Those are things that could be automated as part of a solution. And if you're doing that in the right way, that's how you're going to build the efficiencies. That's how you're going to win the trust of the CFO. And because now you're going to take out the unknown. And that unknown is something which a lot of companies some very large companies and really struggle with. And I gave an example, which I kind of joke around with, is that I've worked at a lot of large companies over the years. And I could tell you, like, from all of my years of working at different organizations, I have laptops for virtually every company I've ever worked for, because they're great at giving you information, but they're horrible at taking it back. And sometimes I've even tried to give it back, and they don't take it back because they have no process in place and to get that back. So you're thinking about it from something as a physical as a computer, and if you're struggling with that, how difficult is it, or how hard to believe is it that someone could still have access to your computer system when they shouldn't, or access to files when they shouldn't? And those are things that every company needs to really, in my mind, take a very hard look at and make sure they have a good process around and ability to automate it.
You did a couple of things there, Steve. You just want to go through security. Security is hard, knowing that. And of course, folks, if you come across any URL which says stevescomputers.com, you know where those computers are coming from. One of the conversations I wanted to have, and Maureen touched upon it a bit, I want to cycle through that, is the notion that when IT, and I have been part of that too, is when CFOs and leaders ask for cost takeout, the first thing that we do is go look for actual takeouts itself. And it was interesting to hear from her that it need not be a takeout. We're not looking at a budget reduction, but what else can you do with the same budget? So realigning resources, giving options, and how are you doing that? That was very interesting conversation, because every time in my past too, where we looked at either sometimes you're given targets, $2 million takeout or $1 million takeout, where she pointed out was it need not be actual takeout. Where can you take that? What are you going to do with that additional $1 million? To have the conversation, with all due respect, with the leaders, to say, where can you siphon out? Because IT is sometimes seen as a place where, there is a lot of money to be taken out, and hence the notion of, takeout. So, I'll let her explain that a bit, but also some experiences that I had with, when we were looking at it from a nonprofit lens, for example, from an OpEx and a CapEx. I always thought, CapEx is a good model too. OpEx, as long as you have the cash flow. So those are some things that I learned from her, and I'll let her share that in a minute.
So the question was around not the OpEx or CapEx. The first question?
The first question was takeout. I mean, what does it actually mean?
Right. So, and how do we think about it?
Yeah.
And I do have to say that throughout my career, one of the things that I have learned, being a finance leader and then being a CFO, is you can give people targets, but if they can't understand and you don't help them come up with a strategy, they're not going to meet it, or they're going to make bad decisions. So when Bipin said, you go out to tech and you say, you know what, I need you to cut $3,000. The first thing they're going to do is they're going to look at their investment portfolio and they're going to cut investments that have downstream impacts to the overall revenue growth of the business, could potentially. It's not like they're going to be able to just create efficiencies and give you back $10 million, or that they've been hiding. There's some sandbagging going on. I absolutely understand that. And it is interesting, because I will tell you, coming into my new organization, that is a practice that they have. Give me a target and they make the target. And they didn't always meet the target, or they didn't know how they would do it. But from my perspective, when it comes to cost cutting, you have to sit with the business and help them understand and come up with a strategy as to what they can realistically achieve. Because it does absolutely no good to the organization to come up with arbitrary percentage cuts or arbitrary numbers. You can end up doing more harm than good. Now, it's not to say that, you get into Q4 and you're not making your numbers. You can tell people stop traveling. I mean, that's really easy. And you can also tell technologies, okay, maybe pull back a little bit, slow down a little bit of the cash burn that's going on. But I guess from my perspective, it's just over my career, one of the things that I've really learned and tried to share with my finance leaders is that you can't give a target without giving a strategy and a way for them to achieve it and working with them on it. Doesn't mean that you're always going to have the strategy, but you have to talk through it, because just throwing a target out there either leads to bad decision making or missed targets. CapEx, OpEx. So this is a really interesting one for me, because having worked at American Express for 28 years, I never thought about CapEx, OpEx. I literally always only worried about OpEx. It was the only thing I ever had to worry about. I tell the story that when I was at American Express, I approved the purchase of a building, $220 million. Never even thought, where are we going to get $220 million? How do I fund that? I was only worried about what was going to hit my OpEx over the next 10 to 20 years based on my long-range plan, and what was going to roll off, what was going to roll on, and the incremental expense. Then I come to nonprofit industry where you're donor funded, or you're relying on different forms of funding to hit your payroll. And so when we started looking at our investments and what we were going to spend on, I didn't care what went into CapEx and what was going to hit my P&L. I wasn't as concerned about hitting my OpEx numbers as I needed to make sure there was cash in the bank so that I could hit payroll and I could pay my vendors. And so it was an entirely different perspective. And I do know in today's kind of environment, there is a lot of opportunity for people to work within those two, which I don't think we had, at least early on in my career, with the cloud and the way in which you get your services, and is it something that you want to pay for on a monthly basis, that you have a little bit more flexibility, or do you have cash but can't afford the expense in your net income targets, so you capitalize. You probably end up spending more when you capitalize, because there's all of these other things you have to consider besides paying one fee to have somebody do everything for you. So again, that does go back to the business cycle and really what your targets are driven on. Is it net income, or is it more cash flow that you have to worry about meeting? And that, to me, is what determines whether you're going to push towards an OpEx solution or push towards a capital investment.
Your thoughts on
There's
that?
Another question. Go ahead.
Your thoughts on that CapEx, OpEx, because you guys are predominantly OpEx kind of model.
Yeah, it's for us, we look at it as trying to, again, understand a business need, figure out where we could add value. So that value, comes in a lot of different ways. I gave one example before on the onboarding and offboarding, but there are a number of different ways in which you're able to really uncover value, and simply by utilizing a solution that's going to solve the business problems. So when we talk about analytics and talk about how information gets pushed out to the GL, my organization, we separate a person from position. And really what that enables companies to do is to set a budget for a position, and then be able to look at how many people filled that position over the course of time, in a year or whatever time period, and then be able to see where you are at any moment in time to see if you're actually on budget, on plan. And plans change and companies change all the time. There's always pivots that are happening for different reasons. And having, again, a solution in place that's going to enable companies to be able to make that change on the fly and be able to have the information at their fingertips is really what's the value add. I joke around with a lot of clients, and I ultimately say, you're not choosing a payroll system. I'm like, at the end of the day, any system out there, you're hoping that they're going to get a net check correct. But it's really a solution that's going to allow each of your business leaders to do their job exceptionally well without having to really let more along the lines of letting the system kind of help guide you and kind of inform you as to what you're supposed to be looking at, as opposed to having the individual have to constantly go searching and gathering the data, because it's just very time consuming and error prone. So that automation and how that structure of the system is set up makes the difference.
And I think to that point, and Bipin, kind of what you were hitting on is, I do think that your industry right now, probably the software as a service and the cloud environment, has really allowed people a lot more flexibility to be a little bit more nimble without this huge capital burden, right? And that they could upgrade, they could pivot, they could enhance without having to have the resources in-house to have to do that, to have all of the backups. I mean, I think there's a number of reasons why in this environment and people not wanting to make that huge investment, and for smaller companies or mid-sized companies, that having that flexibility probably has been what's propelled more of the SaaS, I would think, from a CFO perspective, you know.
TJ, I know there was some questions.
This was like a good example of cost containment effort gone awry.
A cost containment effort gone awry. I've got a perfect example. And this is partly cost containment, and this is giving targets that aren't necessarily reasonable, and it's also making investments without taking everything into consideration. I won't disclose, but what I will tell you is that there was a decision made to implement a new system. The decision was made by finance that the group could implement the new system, but they couldn't have any external support. And they could afford the software, but they couldn't afford consultants to help them build it. And so the line of business then worked with technologies and for 2 years tried to get this system implemented. And after 2 years and probably millions more in expense than had they just had the support up front, the system was never implemented. And so that's where it's a great lesson learned. I think finance did a disservice by allowing them to make any investment without the proper support and the proper funding. So yeah, that was a real life learning. I wasn't involved in finance at that time, just so you know. Yes, they were. I've come to find out.
Another example, first example where CIO was involved, and like I said, the notion that cost takeouts need not be dollar takeouts, but it could be value increase or value reduction. I mean, we always talk about as IT leaders to have the right IT governance models, to go back to the business, reprioritize your programs and projects and check with them. Is that really what you want? I mean, those are things that as low-hanging fruits you would do. But one of the things we're sure, if I could give another example, is me being part of organizations where cost takeouts where it came in the form of RIFs every year. The reduction in force, when it happens every year, as a cost takeout measure, the problem with that is the minute you announce a RIF, guess who the best people leave first? And you get to the bottom of the bottom pile, and then you end up with the situation that you lost the best and you lost the worst people too. I mean, and imagine it happening over years. And I've had conversations with CIOs to talk about it's not fun anymore working here because the talent is gone. Partly because of long term, like Maureen said, you make decisions for a short term period, and then of course we all know that there are notions about what does a CIO shelf life look like. That plays into that a lot. I mean, you're in for parachuted in. You do something, cost measures, cut measures, and you're on. And what does that do to the organization from a long-term perspective? going back to Maureen's conversation about finance team probably acknowledging that was a bad one. It's sometimes a long-term view that you have to take, but you all know, I mean, public companies don't follow that suit because of the quarter-to-quarter pressure and so much. And sometimes IT doesn't get a say in many of these because all of these decisions get played on top of us and asked us to do things. So that was another example that I could think of, which it happened. A real-life example of how the cost containment eventually dragged the organization down from and it was an engineering company too. I mean, they lost skillful engineers, and then you are forced to kind of do an outsourcing, which may or may not be the right solution at some point. So I know questions are coming in. I want to take a pause and ask the audience here if you guys had any questions, thoughts on this topic, and any questions for any of us here.
Very interesting one for environment. Yeah, so do you think organization, I think a lot of organizations, whether it's the IT organization, the CIO, directly reports to CFO. This is the form structure. Or the CFO, I think a lot of IT organizations report to the CFO. And I think that comes down to it's a cost, right? Whereas the view is that it's actually enabler of the business as opposed to the business. How much of today's problem built into the organization by having IT report finance?
I have an answer as a CIO, but I want to get an answer from a CFO person.
I do think that I think it says something about the way the company values IT, without a doubt. If the CIO, if it's a smaller company and it's a VP of technologies, you guys are in a big tech company or something like that, then it's understandable, right? It's a matter of span of control. But if it is a proper CIO, I think, and they're reporting into a COO or a CFO, I think it's the company's view on how they feel about technologies, and I would bet that they probably feel that it's a cost center, it is a service. We talked a little bit about this in my view on technologies, and probably why I'm sitting here today, but I really do feel like they're a partner and somebody that should be, a seat at the table working with me. I do feel at times, just like people view finance, they view technologies as order takers. I'm going to sit here, do what you want, make sure things are running, but not part of the strategic decision making. And so that's just the view that I have. So I would think that the company probably, I think it says something about the organization. And if I were a CIO, I would not want to report into a CFO. Although I would be really nervous. How would you feel about it?
Well, then I want to ask Steve, have you seen these, does it make it difficult for you from a sales cycle, from a product cycle, if CIO reports into who doesn't matter?
It's not something that really has had any necessarily impact on us and how we go about our sales process. For the most part, we're oftentimes we're happy the higher we get in within an organization is usually better. Because obviously the decision making power comes from the top on down. But that being said, I always look at it as again, the more people that we have involved in the conversation that really are giving their input, and hopefully that input is valued. At the end of the day, different companies are going to value certain people more than others. So you may have 10, 15 people in a room, but there may only be a few of them who have a voice that really kind of carries more than the rest of them. But it's something where you're trying to educate the customer, at least in my mind, because I want to be able to look at the customer on like after that sale is done and know that the technology that was sold was the correct technology for what that company needed. And I can't give an honest answer unless I understand everyone's point of view and position on what is really going on and what those challenges are. It's not, sometimes we're asking probing questions and people are reluctant to share for different reasons. But the reason that we're asking is because we want to really help, and without being able to uncover really what some of those challenges are and hear it from a number of different people, it's hard to give the best solution because those solutions could be different. And there might be one vendor that is better at something than another. And if you're not willing to share as a company, you may not end up with the right answer. And you may end up with the wrong system.
So I have a different philosophical tangent to it, and it's interesting because Dan Mazzola and I have had a lot of conversations about it. He's looking at it from a very academic sense. I'll give you the context. I think he and some of his colleagues have been working on some studies which across the last 10 years, which have shown that CIOs are actually now coming from business backgrounds more. And we at SIM have had the conversation about, is that a good thing? And what is it that as technology leaders you're not doing right because you're having this influx of CIOs with business models? And so that's the context. And the philosophical conversation that I had with Dan was, it's an evolving model because some of us are old enough to understand the notion that when IT started talking to business, we had these roles called BAs, business analysts. They were supposed to be the language translators. Then came BSAs. And then over the last 5 years, the notion of BRMs got big. Oh my God, they were the trusted BRMs were the big ones. And then came the notion that CIOs have to speak business language. So then suddenly you have to speak the business language to get to the top of the table. So there's always this notion of climbing and revolving responsibilities. My conversation with Dan was to say that yes, over that period of time, I think we probably have lost, and that's the reason they're asking us to come up with the notion of, you don't speak business. How well are we as CIOs able to articulate a complex, complicated thing in the sense that business understands, in their sense? That's what is going to set us apart as CIOs. And my answer back to you, Simon, would be, I personally don't care. As long as I'm able to provide the value. I don't know if I've been lucky and I had not so great bosses, but they have seen the value that IT can provide and let me be me. And I joke around saying, you don't understand IT, be it a CIO or a CFO, and say, you don't know IT, that's why you let me run around. But the notion that if you're able to articulate that and provide value, where you will start seeing your values when you're invited to board meetings, when you're asked to talk about budget approvals and how do you take the organization ahead of them. It is definitely a quotient of where your organization is. How do they see IT? Do they see IT as progressing their business transformation, creating digital transformation models? The role gets, focus at that point of time, but also, as you have seen, a typical manufacturing facilities, and just calling out manufacturing because of my experience there, you would see CIOs do not typically report into the CEO directly. They go through other channels because it is just a cost center. Probably the CTO gets a higher seat at the table in those cases. But I always tell Dan this, don't make a big deal about it. Let's figure out what we are doing wrong to change that paradigm a bit, so that we can also be seen as that. And now you've seen a big influx of this title change, which, if you see my LinkedIn profile, I've gone through that. Chief Digital and Information Officer. That's another way. A lot of people have asked me what does that mean? And in my case, I picked up the business transformation team, where I manage the product owners and the enterprise PMO and a whole bunch of business-related functions, BRMs, of course, and all of that. So that's another chasm or a bridge we are probably probably building to that notion of trying to translate this big, complicated thing back to them. And I always say this, data, folks, data, and I'm sure you love this, CDOs, we've created a new channel called CDOs, Chief Data Officers, and CISOs. I know CISOs don't love CIOs, they feel that they should be reporting to somebody else, and maybe so in many cases, but the fact that CISOs and CDOs in my mind have the most difficult job, because data and information security are things that they need to translate to business in a better way for them to find that, find the niche for us. That's my 5-minute answer. Laura, I know you had a question.
So the dialogue I'm hearing is traditional, projects, the business. However, the last 2 months, I ended with all of that. And the reality is that the budgets that was in place had to be rethought immediately, as well as if we had a 5-year IT plan. Oftentimes, that's condensed into accomplishing that in a few months, and that costs money. So, my question to you is in your experiences, when you happen to move applications to cloud, build a workforce, in a remote hybrid environment, and then build those collaborations with this organization, what kinds of conversations have you had amongst your fellow C-suite to adjust those budgets and adjusting their thoughts with the IT is no longer just behind the door, they are critical to success. So those were the conversations that you had in the last 18 months to support the reality.
IT budget essentially be thrown out the window.
Thanks for that question, Laura. I'll give a viewpoint from CIO perspective, and you're absolutely right. I mean, everything that was written in academics and books and everything has been thrown out of the window and asked us to be truly nimble. And if you, and everybody, I'm sure, is following the industry, you talk to leaders who probably don't understand IT much even. I'm literally quoting folks like, let's say, Delta CEO Ed Bastian, or Satya Nadella, obviously Microsoft and Adobe. All of them have said the amount of digital transformation that has been forced, not even happened, forced, is almost like McKinsey says 10 years worth of things happening in 1.5 years. So the conversations have been completely different. And I'll give you a personal experience, which fortunately me and Maureen were involved in. We kicked off our finance NetSuite project, combining, as I said, 60 chapters into one instance in January. March hit, everything canceled, consultants cannot travel, chapter members cannot travel for discussions, design conversations, there's always a joke that we had that chart of accounts was Maureen laid down the law. It needs to be one chart of accounts for all 60 organizations. And those conversations in a nonprofit especially cannot have happened, could not have happened in one conversation. But one thing that changed is the notion that we have to move fast. That it just showed us that within the March 2nd to 3rd week, world was not going to be the same. So it was either almost a shape up or ship out kind of a model where we had to move quickly, move in immediately to cloud models. You brought in all kinds of stuff, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, whatever it is, to enable that enable that collaboration. And I remember sitting in April, we talked about Zoom fatigue and everybody being on the screen, and are we going to continue with the project? And we made a decision, yes, we will. We successfully rolled out, but one thing that taught us was a lot more, I saw a lot more empathetical conversations in IT. I know, trust me, it didn't happen before, but the notion about listening and what is possible, what can be made possible, budgets being opened up to make it happen. And then the conversations about CapEx and OpEx, and I'll let Steve talk in a minute, and Maureen too. And I would love to know if, the operation models, the swing that they could have potentially seen, or the sale I can think of making it happen across those, first few months was completely different. Back to a specific question about what kind of conversations, it was conversations about we need to do this now. We've been monkeying around this digital transformation. The conversation was completely different because they felt it too. Like I said, the business leaders felt it that IT has to be, brought in to have conversations. And I was in conversations. Maureen knows this about moving out of facility, and the conversations about, and I was pulled into conversations not related to IT, but everybody was checking in to see if will that work, will that happen. So it was a definitely defining moment if you look at it from the last 6 months perspective, or the first 6 months perspective, and how it changed. Thoughts on that, Steve?
It's been many years since I've seen companies use on-premise solutions. I've been selling SaaS software for 15, 20 years, and quite frankly, I'm like, it is very challenging to operate in an on-prem kind of solution versus a SaaS environment. I'll give you an example. I'm working with a library that's in Georgia right now, where they have an on-prem system, and just for the amount of IT work that's required to keep all in the system up to date, to be able to control access to the solution, and to maintain relationships with other third-party systems, it is just an enormous kind of undertaking for any organization. So having a SaaS-based solution where, again, if a pandemic unfortunately kind of forces people to kind of go that route, it's something that allows companies to be able to make quick decisions, be able to pivot and when necessary, give employees better access to data that maybe they wouldn't normally have in an easy to kind of use fashion on an on-prem solution. So a SaaS-based solution in my mind is something that I expect when talking with virtually all of my clients, as I really don't see too many on-prem solutions anymore, unless you get into some really large organizations that have kind of been slow in migrating over.
Well, I think that during the initial phases, as Bipin mentioned, we were working together, and I really didn't see any true impact. We moved forward with our project. We did, the majority of our fundraising was done at the first half of the year. So I felt like, while we did have some, reduction in our overall net income, we didn't really have to stop anything. And actually, it probably cost us less because our consultants weren't traveling in. But so I didn't see an impact there as kind of the first 6 months of the pandemic. Now, I will tell you, the company that I'm with now, the organization, they were all very much on-prem, and to the point where there were a lot of people, and I can talk about my finance organization, that didn't have laptops, which I just couldn't understand, because you would think that everybody did. And in this day and age. And so they were sent home with like these black boxes that they I'd never even heard of them, and so we did have to adjust a lot as far as going out and upgrading laptops. And we had people with 10-year-old laptops. And so we have had to pivot investment where I'm at now to cover some of those costs. And so there definitely was that. And had we been a little bit more, in the cloud or remote ready, like we were at Make-a-Wish, we would not have had to change kind of investment strategy. But it did, I will tell you, it didn't happen, I feel like, at Make-a-Wish, but it did definitely happen right now.
Right. I'm looking at some of the questions, that we had planned for, and we talked a lot about what are some of the important things to consider when considering SaaS applications. The thought behind that was sometimes even IT loves the notion of SaaS because of reduced cost, but at what cost does it happen to from an overall perspective? OpEx cost, is it a running? Is it a completely an OpEx model where the CFO is okay to be spending? And one of the conversations that we had, and Maureen mentioned it, was it totally depends on the cash outlay of the organization. If you don't have incoming cash, or what does your cash outflow look like, it would rather be better to go into a CapEx model, things that you wouldn't have thought about from an IT perspective. Another example that I could think of was when I was having conversations about insourcing versus outsourcing. It was funny that I went down the path of multiple insourcing gigs after being an outsourcing partner for almost 20 plus years. But having those conversations with Maureen, especially CFO, she brought to me the notion about cost per seat, building cost, and things that IT would not have thought about. Me as a leader had not thought about when I'm doing insourcing. She asked me questions about, have you thought about the building cost? Have you thought, for me, it was just like to like, how much am I paying the vendor versus I'm going to run it with a 5-member team. So those were some of the other items that we kind of talked around. But most of it, I think we covered. We talked about spending limits, CapEx and OpEx. What should CIOs be limited with? Again, it depends on the organization limits and so on. So I think we are pretty much done, other than if any of you have any questions or the online has any questions, thoughts, any parting shots?
Well, I apologize ahead of time on this. This is probably an unanswerable question. It's the age-old question of budget. How do you keep people from feeling like they should not be paid? What I mean by that is run rate, and there's a great idea on how to save money, end up losing the end because that cost no longer has the same level of run rate. I know there's got to be a certain level of trust between CIO and CFO that you can remove some of that, and the team that's actually now responsible for all of those things is now not punished because of that. So, but it's cyclical, right? If I'm on a 6-month run rate, or I'm on an 18-month run rate, and now I pull some of that back, I get punished for that. So how do you resolve that between CFO and CIO?
Thank you. So it's the whole use it or lose it attitude. And again, I do think that it's based on the maturity of the organization and where you're at and what some of your challenges are. This is where I think IT could probably do a better job in the way in which they present things, or the way in which they value what they bring, because there's metrics that you can look at, and whether it's revenue per employee or net income per employee versus just IT as a cost of total OpEx. And so it's understanding, are there other ways to show the value so that when you do have that run rate saved, you can either reinvest it in something. And the other thing I would recommend is, if you're going to implement something that's going to do a save, you want to be upfront with it and then immediately say what it is you're going to use that save for. And that's when you can have that discussion about, as an organization, we can either afford it or we can't. But I think that's one way, you know, yes, I'm going to drop here, but I'm going to reinvest it, and this is the value that I'm going to bring. And so it's being able to talk about the value that you bring is probably the best way to resolve it. And then there are just some times where it's like everybody has to feel a little bit of the pain and pull back just a little bit. And, you know, even if you could use it, you're not going to be able to. So, what about you?
It's definitely a complicated question from a CIO perspective. So as we're winding down on time, I'll say this. I've been on both sides. There are times when towards the end of the year, I've gotten calls from the CFO saying, we have 2 million more to spend. Can you do that? They look at only IT. Only IT can spend 2 million in a month. And I've been on the other side where, you know, it's been, okay, it's 2 months in, we got to stop all projects. And this is where some of the strategy comes in, and I call it strategy because your models on resourcing plays a big part here, because if you're heavily outsourced and things like that, those are the levers you can pull, and you have a great relationship with outsourcing partners because that's why you use them to turn the levers of whether you use it or you burn through the money. And so back to the conversation about, you know, how do CIOs get put in spot by the CFOs? I mean, as Maureen said, it's a relationship thing. You know, if you feel valued, I think they'll give you a heads up if it's a public company quarter over quarter. And if it's not, also, you know, they'll give you a sense of where we are headed and, you know, give you ample time ahead of time, as opposed to making you feel, you know, putting you in a spot at the last minute. So I would say, I mean, I joke about it, but I say two people that you absolutely have to love in your organization, your chief HR officer and your CFO, and tell them both that very well many times and make them feel that. So that would be my answer. All right, with that, I think we've had a fantastic conversation. Time just flew by. Thank you so much for coming in person and for attending the call on Zoom. Like I said, you know, as we go through this, we'll iron out any kinks that we have and, you know, make it a better experience, if you will, from next time onwards. But thank you for attending. Appreciate it.